Thank you. It's an honor to be here. That's the title of my talk. It's humbling. Basically, what I will try to make some reflections on is the type of political order we see and where it's heading. And of course, the natural point of departure for this is the EU's white paper that came out in March last year. They have 5 scenarios. I'm basically using 3. And these are the idea that the EU is becoming a segmented political order. I will explain that. The other question is whether there is or can be a process of core consolidation. And the third one is also the spectacle of fragmentation. So I will go through these. Now, as a point of departure, if we look at the white paper, it said that it assumed that form would follow function. I'm far less convinced of that. And I think it is important to understand where we are now. That is, because also the white paper didn't provide us with a baseline or a clear sense of what type of starting point we have, where the European Union is at present. So then the discussion of scenarios becomes quite ungrounded in that sense, and I think it is fundamentally important to try to get a sense of where we are now in order to look at alternatives. So I discussed several of these that basically take us in 2 different directions from the present. So the first is an idea of getting a sense of where we are now, and then discuss 2 possible trajectories in different developments for the EU. And I think this is made important also by the fact that, as was well explained to us by the Undersecretary just now, the various types of crises and challenges facing the EU. Also that the fact that they could easily reinforce each other and that they are linked together somehow. And exactly how these patterns work requires deeper, more systematic follow-up and analysis. And I also think that the EU has gone through a structural mutation in the process, in the way the crisis hit, but also in the way the EU itself handled the crisis, should suggest that there is a kind of structural mutation going on and that we need to understand this. In addition, we do know that there are path dependencies, that there are structural conditioning factors in the EU that we need to consider whenever we discuss and think about reform efforts. And also whether certain aspects of the crisis have reinforced certain types of paths and trajectories and therefore blocked the possibility or rendered the possibility of moving and taking up other tracks and so on more difficult. So of course this is, so I provide you with a kind of an institutionalist type of backdrop to this. But I think it's imperative. So the starting point is that we need to understand where we are now. What kind of system are we actually facing? And I'm not talking about principles, normative commitments. I'm trying to look much more directly at what is going on. So I have a much more pedestrian outlook on this. Because the EU is very contested. There are very many different views of what it is and what it should be. So I'll just try to open the debate by giving some reflections on where I think we are. And of course, what we have seen so far is mainly a kind of muddling through type of approach. And I think that this has to do with increased segmentation. And I think this has to do with the structural mutations that the EU has gone through. And I think that it also has to do with the EU's handling of the crisis. At the same time, I want to bring in the idea of segmentation, segment, and segmented political order. This is an old term. you see it in economics and sociology across a number of different fields. So segment is a very familiar notion. It comes with different types of readings and understandings. And many political systems have elements of political segmentation. So this is not anything distinctive. This is not anything about sui generis or anything like this. It's rather taking a rather familiar notion, but also trying to locate that in a discussion about the EU. So my argument is that the EU has been moving towards a segmented political order. That's raising the stakes. For instance, in the US, they were talking about segments in a political system, kind of iron triangles within certain types of sectors of the political system, linking interest groups, bureaucrats, experts together in certain triangles in the system. This is a familiar one from societal corporatist states such as Norway. This is also very familiar. In agriculture, we have a very strongly developed type of segment. But I'm raising the bar by saying that maybe we need to think about the EU as a segmented political order. So I'm I'm putting down the thesis or the hypothesis, basically. It's a working hypothesis that this might be something we need to think about in terms of the structure itself, how the system itself is configured, not simply an element of the system. This is, of course, a very risky undertaking. Can you talk about a segmented political order as a political system? And I'm not saying it is there, but I'm saying that we see traits, movements towards such a system. Okay, so that's the idea, and this is a hypothesis. Okay, I'm not claiming that this is a full account of the current, but I think there are problems with this, and that's also why I think it's necessary to bring this up as a possible reading of the current developments. Okay, and in order to do this, we go back to the general literature on segmentation and segments, and I think there are basically two core elements in this. The first is what I call a segmental logic. It's a cognitive bias. It's about the mind frame, mindset. So we start with individual actors, almost like, that there are certain types of orientations, certain ways in which they perceive of reality that are becoming very prominent, and that this is a selection mechanism. It's a bias. And the thing, what I'm trying to say is that it manifests itself in a distinctive way of framing problems. A systematic way in which you frame problems in the same way. A number of people from different locations frame the problems in the same way. And that applies to how they think about dealing with the problems. So there's a systematic, unified notion of how you understand the problem and how you want to address it. And then, therefore, also, what are the possible solutions in place? So the idea is that there is a certain orientation, a certain mind frame, and that this directs actors towards certain courses of action and excludes other ones, okay? So this is a sort of general principle. So a systematic selection bias is one of the elements. So this is a kind of closure. It's a kind of a mental closure. You have this from a lot of sociology with trained incapacity among experts, for instance, that experts learn about some things and then they basically forget about or unlearn a lot of other aspects because they become specialists. So in a sense, this is an extension of the idea of specialization, but it's a particular form of specialization. But of course, expertise is something that will figure into this kind of picture. Views of the world, ideologies can also have similar effects by blocking out alternatives and focusing on certain things. So there is a cognitive, a mental, an orientational aspect to this. But It would never solidify, it would never direct actions. You could never talk about a political system as segmented simply on the basis of cognitive factors. Whatever actors think, they will be arrested, corrected, and so on by various types of institutions. And you have different types of institutions affecting this. So this is not enough. It has to have some kind of entrenching. There has to be something that solidifies this, that helps ensure that you have this unified directional push that then actually affects decisions. So there must be something more, and that is about structures, procedural arrangements, institutional arrangements. It's embedded, okay, in certain forms, and they enable and sustain this type of bias. You call this institutional logic too. An institution, by the way, is organizing in and organizing out. That's the very nature of an institution. So where I'm saying that this is a particular form of institutional bias in which several institutions are directed towards the same kind of orientation. Okay, I know this is a bit abstract, but I will get more into details and try to pin this down a bit more specifically. And of course, it has to do with functional domains. And the thing is that the idea of a segment is that it crosses different institutional bounds. It mobilizes and activates and is embedded in a number of different institutions. It's not one institution that has a particular bias. It is a network. That's the idea. It kind of has a kind of a horizontal across, but it works within functions. But it, for instance, is about all those suppliers within a functional domain, tying these together into this type of cognitive bias. And that also means you have pathologies in governing. Because there will be limits to coordination. There will be systemic biases in problem conceptions that produce suboptimal outcomes. And with that, you will also have legitimacy fallouts and problems emanating from it. You'll have forms of exclusion and alienation as part of this. Okay, so segmented political order is the thesis. The idea is that this somehow permeates the whole system, that it mobilizes so that the system itself is much more geared to this. And this is, of course, why I'm uncertain whether one can make such a wild claim about the EU. But I just put it down as a set of analytical categories to try to direct us towards the macroscopic aspects. And of course, it would mean that there will be several forms of closure, several forms of biases, several cognitive biases that the system will be holding. And that will mean that the system will be having significant problems of actually coordinating and cutting across these, more so than a system that's more open, of course. And with this also follows this last point, because if we have segmentation, we can also have desegmentation. And a democratic political system is one that has a balance between segmenting and desegmenting tendencies. Parliaments, ombudsmen, other types of transparency agents pry open segments. They challenge these types of close communities of experts and so on. And that's how the political systems manage to have a balance between harnessing expertise at the same time as having an open and broader type of political interaction, and being able to address things and see how they relate to each other without getting trapped in certain types of tracks or logics. So the political systems are configured precisely to have parliaments irritating these types of functional domains, because people are asking questions. It was a very good example of the BSE crisis in EU. When this was inside the community commission system and so on, it was dealt with as more of a technical issue. And the moment the European Parliament got news of this, it started saying, wait, this is a health issue. So they pried it open and said, look, lives are at stake. You really have to take different types of measures. So they opened this up, and suddenly, by reframing the question and applying different techniques on it, you got a different reading and much more, a greater mobilization to deal with the issue. So just as it's a sort of one example of how these types of representative democratic bodies, because they are occupied by people with different forms of training and orientations and so on, that's their task also to open up this. So I'm also saying, of course, that political systems rely on expertise. That's not the point. The point is that if it becomes very much mobilized and directed in along certain tracks, we can get pathologies emanating from this. And it's finding a good balance between different types of bodies that is important for the functioning of political systems. Now, with the EU, I think there are basically two aspects of kind of cognitive bias that are starting to manifest themselves in the EU. One is the socioeconomic aspect. Maria Bartel wrote a nice article in the European Law Journal on market rationality. And I think in order to understand this, I think we need to combine organizational sociology with law. And because I will read something that I think is telling of this, how the four freedoms have taken on a particular logic and are manifesting and solidifying this as a kind of broader type of cognitive bias in the EU. And this is from what Agustín Menéndez has written about in terms of mutual recognition. So he says that a critical turning point was when a ban on any product that was legally sold in any other member state of the communities would, prima facie, constitute a disproportionate infringement on the constitutional principle of free movement of goods. And I continue, raising this principle to a standard of European constitutional law, which happened long before the crisis struck, unleashed a significant process of integration, largely driven by private sector actors and the interplay between private market actors and courts, notably the Court of Justice of the European Union. That altered the equation for states, which now needed to get exemptions from the EU by going to the EU, rather than simply erecting national borders to the outside world. We thus see how one configuration of actors in the EU within the community system, but which cuts across the public-private divide, has been instrumental in fostering horizontal market harmonization. Parliaments were typically at the sidelines of this dynamic process. Okay, so this is more of an institutional, legal institutional account of how, broadly speaking, the understanding of market rationality has come in. So there is a certain type of conditioning. And I think that conditioning is reinforced by the EU's regulatory style and also and therefore the limits of policy instruments it has, and also the limitations on fiscal means. So there are further institutional factors of this that are sort of reinforcing this type of legally structured conditioning. And remember, it is a dynamic process that links private sector actors with the EU system, market actors. And towards, like Turkula Isiksel has been talking about market citizenship, and the type of stronger embedding of market actors in this type of system. So this is typically a mix of a kind of cognitive orientation with institutional elements. The other one, which I think is a bit more hazy, but I think it's still there, is securitization. And we have seen this in the refugee crisis from the focus on humanitarian concerns to a stronger onus on security. It has many sources, and it's operating both in justice and home affairs and in foreign and security policy. But I think there is a logic that is emanating. How well entrenched that is something I need to look at much more carefully. But I think there is a tendency towards that as a type of cognitive bias in terms of understanding issues, much more as a type of security concerns. And of course, it also has bearings on the general notion of sovereignty and states insisting on sovereignty and so on. So I think there is a mutually reinforcing element here among a certain type of cognitive orientation and some institutions. And I think also what White is referring to as an emergency mentality is amplifying this, not because it is generating a particular cognitive bias, but because it is making it much more difficult to understand what is normality and what is return to normality in this. So in that sense, it helps to fuzzy over and confuse the orientation in this, and that in that sense actually also to some extent aiding a process towards a type of segmentation. And I also think that the structural elements of the EU are conducive to the argument of segmented order. Because from Maastricht onwards, the EU has been a kind of two-track system. Now, okay, this is a very rough reading of the EU in terms of, on the one hand, the community system and the other, the pillars. The two other pillars. You could say, okay, the EU has abolished these. Yeah, but the decision instruments and the decision procedures vary depending on whether you're in the community system or whether you are in some still elements of, well, fiscal policy and foreign security policy and so on, because of the strong intergovernmental component in that system. So the basic principles are, on the one hand, the supranational and the intergovernmental. So the EU has both elements, and in a difficult balancing act between the two. And each of these has its distinctive policy instruments and also ways of organizing in ideas and an approach to dealing with issues. More proceduralized, more legally embedded in the first track, and more bargaining style and soft, what I call soft fusion, in the first one. Now, why I think this is also actually conducive to the notion of segmentation is because of the way in which we have a horizontal functional separation between the supranational community and the more intergovernmental aspects. That's a functional differentiation. And it constrains horizontal coordination. And you can also see this, for instance, with the parliament's own different presence in these two tracks, basically. So it has generated a certain types of constraint. That is amplified by the way in which the community system tends to depoliticize issues, whereas you have the bargaining issue in the core powers and so on of the state in the other, more intergovernmental system. So you have more of sort of a policy making in the community system and more politics in the other. This is a very, very rough sketch, but it's just sort of trying to tease out more explicitly sort of the underlying principles. And what I think is amplifying this is precisely this idea, the fusion. So for me, the EU is not a system of institutions aloof from the member states. The member states are deeply embedded in the EU institutions. Look at the Council's system itself, the comitology system and so on. The member states in the EU are much more embedded in this system than in any other federal system. So the fusion idea, I think, is a very powerful one, but it means that you have, on the one hand, a horizontal functional separation, at the same time as a coming together at the base of this. So it's a fusion. So it generates also, therefore, certain forms of lock-in, that states lock themselves into this type of structure, especially in the community system, because the officials are implicated in the decision procedures. I've used the idea from Michael Sayward of shape-shift officials. The whole community system, they are always addressing different constituencies, speaking to them. And that's also why you have problems with accountability games, because who are they talking to? Sometimes to the national constituency, sometimes to the European constituency. They can play this. That's how the structure works. So the embedding of officials in this, but it also means that there is a stronger lock-in. It's more difficult for them to escape because they are implicated in all the decisions, in this sense. At the same time, the structural configuration also puts significant constraints on what, for instance, the first track, the community system, can do, because it's lack of fiscal means. And that this is also retained through this kind of functional horizontal separation. So that's why this system is lopsided, but it is actually, in that sense, ironically quite centralized. I think the Eurozone crisis has reinforced these types of patterns of segmentation. For these types of factors, it has increased built-in biases, and when it comes to the Eurozone, there is now a debate going on, and my colleagues know, and many of you know much more than me about this, but I can say that if you try to pin down this idea of bias, there's several types of readings. One is, it could be flawed economic models that we see in the Eurozone. It could be particular epistemic communities of economists, very much also located in the ECB. It could be powerful stakeholders and politicians relying dogmatically on these models, or it could be even academically sound models applied selectively and mechanically. Any of these readings is possible. I think that we probably see a combination of these that is reinforcing a type of bias. So I'm not qualified to make a judgment on what are these most significant ones. You need very serious training in political economy to do that. But these are the accounts coming out of a type of bias that has been reinforced in the Euro crisis. And I think this amplifies the structural disposition towards kind of segmentation we see. So I think that this system is less susceptible to legal rule and predictable patterns of interaction among states and other actors, and it's more sensitive to relations of power. So it also is weakening coordination. And this is about the fusion of levels, I think, reduces the scope for exit. And it also, I think, exacerbates what I call an expectations performance gap. That people saddle the EU with expectations, but they don't provide it with the necessary resources to carry these out. Of course, Brexit will also have an impact on this and come into this. I'm not going to go into that now. Have I 5 more minutes? Excellent. Okay, I'll just quickly say something about the other two trajectories. So, okay, I've tried now to give you a reading of what I think has been happening to the EU with the crisis. It's a thesis. But I think what is important when we are discussing other alternatives is with this kind of structure in place, it in itself will condition the possibilities for further actions. So when we discuss reforms, we have to keep in mind where we are now. And that, of course, has a lot to do with, for instance, core consolidation. And you have the familiar plans on this, of how to do that, lifting and concentrating possibly organizations inside the Eurozone to solidify this. But if we do this without doing anything with the fusion, the type of centralization and the kind of biases we have can be extended, and the system can be overly centralized in the core like that. In fact, it can become even more so unless we devise a clearer delineation of tasks and also therefore roll back some tasks to the member states. So there's a risk in simply just relying on the current system in this. So I'm suggesting that a core consolidation doesn't only require a treaty change, but it requires a serious consideration of the relation between levels, that one actually will have to get out of some of this type of fusion between levels in order to do so. And therefore equip the EU with the necessary means to carry out its tasks, but roll it back because it will be overloading, it will be overly centralized if this is simply lifted up to the EU level, because of the imbrication now between member states and EU institutions. That generates a structural temptation to take on all kinds of things, but doing so in a very biased way. That's my message, basically. So whether this is organized along bipolar or unipolar lines in that sense is very important. also, I think what we have to keep in mind is that there is an important distinction between polity and policy differentiation. In the Eurozone, I think we already now see policy differentiation, that institutions are taking on and concentrating on activities inside the Eurozone, but the institutions haven't been reconfigured to serve the Eurozone mainly. So that's, of course, the strong version of a core consolidation. If you have a further policy differentiation, there will be significant legitimacy problems and accountability issues in this, because the policies will be conducted inside the Eurozone in relatively informal means without actually having the adequate legally embedded and entrenched institutions taking care of these. So that's actually a very problematic scenario. So there's a number of factors. Also, the idea of leadership was addressed yesterday, how to do this, but I just wanted to point the fact that this takes a stronger look at requires a stronger look at the current structure if we're going to get there. And particularly, I think one needs to pay attention to this segmenting components. Of course, another dilemma in doing so is that the European Council must be a very important operator in this. At the same time, if you really rely on that, what kind of assurance do you have? So it again also has to do with how you organize a treaty process. If this is going to prove successful, it has to be a different type of process. That in itself is a significant challenge. Okay. The implications, well, if you actually manage to get a kind of bipolar structure here and this type of system, then the shift will be to those that are out. And then, of course, there's the question of two-tiered or three-tiered outs and so on, and the relation among all those states that are no longer members in, or even in the Eurozone. And how the EU also frames this in terms of those that are members but not still in the Eurozone. So, I mean, there's a lot of different types of questions. But I think the division line then will be much more between the ins and the outs of this. And for the UK, it's going to be really interesting to find out where it's going to be located in this kind of scheme. If the EU manages to move forwards, given the length it will take to negotiate Brexit, the EU has quite a bit of time to reconfigure itself in the process. 2 more minutes on the last scenario. Basically, This is about how this can come about, further just serious questioning and so on. It's an exacerbation of a process of fragmentation, of segmentation, by the way. Further weakening of coordination and other types of factors. And I think it's important then to keep in mind that there's no guarantee that fragmentation will stop at the borders of member states. That's why I'm not using disintegration. I'm using fragmentation, saying that, look, a process unleashed where the European order is dismantled can have significant repercussions inside states because the states have become Europeanized. They've been embedded in the EU structure. Therefore, the process can be much more dramatic inside of states. Regions will see opportunities that they didn't have before because of the lack of order and structure. So this will be a much more treacherous, much more dangerous process, is my thinking. There's a number of different possibilities of this, internal ones and also external ones that could generate and push the EU in that type of direction. I'm not going to go into that now. I just want to mention this, that this also actually has to do with learning. I mean, my argument in terms of segmentation is that the EU has long been caught in what Martin Olsen called a competency trap. It's a learner lock-in, that it is able to go on and develop policies and so on, but within a limited remit. This is also a manifestation of a kind of cognitive bias, by the way, in learning. But it's not able to adjust to the environment, and it's becoming increasingly out of step with the environment. And if this is exacerbated with crises or shocks and so on, you can move from a competency trap to an incompetency trap, where every effort at reform fails, new effort is spurred, and that fails further, and everybody loses faith in the very system. This is definitely still a possible trajectory. But I mean, in this case, I'm including the notion of learning in the way in which we are looking at the EU, because even segmentation also can include thinking about learning. But the point is that there are very selective forms of learning with biases. Okay, so the EU today is vulnerable to external and internal shocks. There is a need for a compelling account to give impetus to the reforms that are necessary. We need a federalism, or whatever we want to call it, that is capable of connecting with Europe's centuries-long preoccupation with balancing unity and diversity, capable of balancing shared rule with self-rule in a democratically viable manner. Thank you.